George and the Gargoyle Who Lived in the Garden. Chapter 1. The Dream. George was running as fast as he could, faster than ever before in his life. Faster and faster. His scrawny, skinny legs were scampering up the little hill and down into the forest beyond. The backwind swept his dirty blonde floppy fringe from his face. Tears streaming from his eyes blew backwards into his ears. His nose was running too. But there was no time to stop and find a tissue, and very likely, he knew, there would be none in any of his pockets. Dodging left and right, he managed to avoid running into the trees. This was by no means easy. There were hundreds of them, thousands maybe, he reckoned, all different kinds. And in some places they grew so close together that he scraped his knees and elbows as he tried, without slowing down, to get through the narrow gaps between them. He could not keep up the murdering pace, of course, and when finally, utterly exhausted, every fibre of his energy used up, his legs heavy like lead, a tree mercifully broke his fall. Instinctively he braced for the collision, but nothing could have prepared him for the fire in his hands as the violence of the impact ripped through his body. Had he given himself whiplash? Ignoring the pain, he darted behind the tree. Its trunk felt hard and comforting on his back. He was gasping for breath, his throat dry, lungs on fire. But even the short respite was too much for his tired legs. He slid down the tree's moss-bedecked trunk to the forest floor. Once there, he sat panting, sweat running down his back and face, his burning hands in his lap. The frantic thumping of his heart produced a kind of out-of-body sensation. He couldn't remember if he'd ever heard or read anything about hearts exploding from exhaustion. It felt like his was trying to do just that. As his breathing returned to normal, he realized that the forest was very quiet. It seemed deserted. But as he continued to strain to hear any kind of sound, he fancied he could feel the entire forest holding its breath, waiting with him. Waiting, he realized, for any sound of the thing. There, he heard it again, a loud squawking sort of sound, unlike anything he had ever heard before. The thing was definitely following him. He was way too scared even to peep around the tree trunk. Instead, he sank lower, manoeuvring himself behind some sparse shrub that grew there, and hoped that whatever the thing was, it would pass him by. But instead, loud, swishing noises now joined the squawking sounds. They were getting louder and louder, which meant that the thing was getting nearer and nearer. It sounded humongous. George shut his eyes tight and tried his hardest to control his breathing. Perhaps if it could not hear him, it would not find him. Suddenly, silence. The thing made no sound at all. No more squawking sounds, no more swishing noises. It did not even breathe, if it breathed. And the abrupt stillness was far, far worse, because now George could not tell where it was. At least when he could hear it, he could tell that it was someplace behind him. He forced himself to peep, first using just one eye. Satisfied that all he could see was the green of the trees and the darker green of the shrubs, he opened both eyes and turned his head slowly to the left, intending to glance behind the tree. Just then, an enormous, great, big, giant purple eye appeared. It blinked at him. George screamed and screamed and screamed and screamed. "Georgie, shush now, hush. It was just a bad old dream. Hush now," George heard his mum say before he was completely awake, and felt her comforting hand on his arm. "What's this bloody racket in the middle of the night?" bellowed his father from the doorway. His pyjama bottom was twisted and his hair stood up, matching the mood of his ruffled eyebrows. He would have looked quite comical, but with glasses balanced on the bridge of his nose and his arms folded tight across his chest, he managed to look as fierce as he always did. "Every bloody night." "It's all right, Mike," said George's mum in her soothing voice, but her eyes said, "No swearing." "George was just having a bad dream. Go back to bed. I'll stay with him." "But every bloody night," Mr. Faraday repeated. obstinately ignoring his wife's warning looks. "When will it ever stop so we can have some peace and quiet in this house? You'd better buck up your ideas, my lad. Some of us have to go to work in the morning to keep you in food and clothes and a roof over your head. The least you can do is show some consideration and let me sleep, damn it," he said, yawning through his words. "It's okay," Mrs. Faraday said again, a little sterner this time. "I'll make sure he's all right. Go back to bed. I won't be long." "But this nonsense has to stop now. It's been going on since he was a kid." "I've had enough," Mr. Faraday said as he walked farther into the room. "It was just a bad dream, Mike. He'll soon go back to sleep, and then he'll be all right. You'll see." It looked as though his mum wanted to add that George was still a little kid, but clearly thought better of it than to start a debate with her husband in that state at that hour. But Mike Faraday seemed to be working himself up into a state of fury the more he talked. His face turned an alarming shade of crimson. "And you're encouraging him to be a wimp. My father would never have stood for this. We're too soft on the boy, I keep telling you," he said, and left. "And my mother would never have mollycoddled me the way you're fussing over George. It won't help him in the real world, you know." George's mum stroked his damp hair from his forehead. Together they listened to his father's angry footsteps stomping down the corridor. All the while he continued to grumble something about how George could not possibly be his son, as no son of his would be such a wuss. Oh no, his son would be strong, a hero in fact. His son would not be screaming like a little girl night after night because of some silly dreams. George blushed at his father's harsh words. He lowered his head, hoping that his mum had not noticed his red face. But his heart burned, as it had umpteen times before, with shame and the yearning to find some way to be normal, at least in his father's eyes. "I'm okay, Mum, really," George said moments after his parents' bedroom door slammed shut in a way that sounded disgusted and final. George was drenched with sweat, and his mother retrieved dry pyjamas from the wardrobe for him to change into, and then left the room on the pretext of getting some water, when a perfectly good glass of water stood on his bedside table. But he was grateful for her sensitivity in giving him some privacy. When she returned, her mouth smiled at him, but her eyes looked worried. "Your father is right, you know. You've been having these bad dreams most of your life. It can't be good for you to keep having your sleep disrupted like this every night. I'm wondering if we should go to see the doctor. What do you think?" The next day, the pleasant lady doctor recommended that George see a counsellor who could help him to work through the reasons why he had such bad dreams. The doctor's smile was fascinating, mostly because she had a ruby set into one of her front teeth, and as a result, George nearly missed the important piece of information that the counsellor might also be able to show him how to stop from having the bad dreams completely. That was news. It had never occurred to him that he could choose to stop himself having bad dreams. His apprehension lessened a little, and the more he thought about it, the more curious he became about the mysterious counsellor, who sounded more like a magician than a doctor. "But," his mum said in the car on the way home, "we'd have to wait till after the Easter holidays for you to see the counsellor, Georgie. You know, we'll be leaving for South Africa soon. I don't think we'll be able to fit it all in before then." George already knew he was staying in London whilst his parents were going on holiday to South Africa. He also knew that it was not really a holiday, but rather yet another fishing trip for his fishing-mad father. But he couldn't help wondering why his mum would tag along to something so boring. And honestly, he was much more excited about staying with his mum's outrageous arty sister than he was about seeing some silly old counsellor. This would be the first time, however, that he would be staying with her for nearly the whole Easter holiday. His mind reeled with the possibilities of what she might have planned for them. Her love of whiz-kid schemes to keep everything a great secret knew no bounds. She loved doing that almost more than the surprise itself. And the lengthy processes leading up to the actual surprise almost always sorely tested his patience. But it was definitely worth it in the end. Her ideas were always amazing and indeed surprising. Mind you, anything that deviated slightly from his usual boring existence would have counted as a welcome surprise. and around his zany aunt it always felt like Christmas, whatever the time of the year. But no matter how hard he tried, not once had he ever been able to find out her schemes or what she had planned for them beforehand. What he liked best about her was that she always treated him like an adult, even when he was still a little kid, and that made him feel so much better about himself than he usually did. And coming to think of it, Aunt Di's flat always felt completely safe too, in every way. He had never had any bad dreams there. But his excitement flagged quite a bit when they got home, and he saw his father's car, already back from work, parked in the driveway. His father must have been watching out for their arrival, because no sooner had they driven up to the house and got out of the car than Mr. Faraday practically shoved them inside the front door. For the first time since he had known him, his father seemed as excited as George had been himself just a few moments ago. "George," he said, sitting down on the sofa opposite his son, "you're too young now, but in a few years' time you can come along too." He shoved a glossy brochure towards George. "I'll be getting into one of these galvanized steel cages, which is then lowered into the ocean. See? One like this. That's the very best way to observe sharks, and those guys in Cape Town are the most experienced in the world. I'll take loads of pictures, and I'll tell you all about it when we're back. It's very exciting, don't you think?" His father's toothy grin reminded George all too vividly of sharks. "Thank goodness I'm staying in London," thought George, a shiver running through his body. He could not imagine anything more nightmarish than sharks, although perhaps his father's new excited persona was a close second. One more sleep, thought George as he got ready for bed that night, and one more school day, and then holiday! Yay! Tully Tucker and his gang, collectively known as the Fearsome Foursome, were already lounging at the school gate when George arrived at school the next morning. "Oh, no," thought George when he saw them. He tried to walk slower so that he could duck past them unseen. Somehow, he was one of only a few in his class who had managed to avoid any entanglement with the four bigger boys the entire year so far, and he wanted to keep it that way. But it was too late. They'd spotted him. All smiles and faked friendliness, they advanced towards him, scattering smaller children in all directions. "Hey, Georgie, how's it hanging?" shouted Tully. A few of the younger students glanced at George and sniggered. George decided that the best way to deal with Tully, who was clearly on a mission, was to play along and not to let on how much he hated being called Georgie. Tully grabbed George by the arm and started marching him away from there towards the trees opposite the playing fields. The gang's furtive glances towards the school building, presumably to make sure a teacher had not spotted them, confirmed George's suspicions that they were up to no good. He braced himself for whatever they were going to throw at him. One thing was for sure, it would be ugly. He had seen them working over younger boys often enough to know what might be in store for him. "Tully," responded George lamely, "you're here early." "Waiting for you, Georgie boy, waiting for you," said Tully, and clapped a confidential arm around George's narrow shoulders, pressing George's head into his chest with his other hand. Tully and his gang members stood a whole head taller than the other boys in George's class, supposedly because they were a year older. There were rumours that they'd been expelled from previous schools and had to repeat a year at St. Paul's. No one actually knew for sure, and he didn't expect them to admit to it any time soon, even if it was true. But George knew that many of the other students accepted it as gospel and thought the Fearsome Foursome a bit dense because of it. George, on the other hand, had never once thought of any of them as stupid. He knew they were just lazy and unmotivated. He had witnessed once too often the ingeniously cruel ways they dreamt up to torment others. Tully, who regularly and easily won all debates, was particularly quick-witted, and George suspected was probably just bored because his intelligence was not being challenged at all by the normal school curriculum. Somehow George freed his head from underneath Tully's arm, aware that his hair had been severely ruffled. If he had known this was going to happen, he would not have bothered to comb it this morning. Trying to make his actions look natural, he faked a cough and tried to squirm his way further out of Tully's grasp. But the grip on his shoulders tightened, and George ended up walking squeezed against the bigger boy, the smell of Tully's surprisingly sophisticated cologne in his nostrils. He was taken aback by how muscular Tully's body felt beneath his clothes, because Tully somehow always seemed to dodge out of any physical activity at school and was not generally known for his athleticism. It was worrying because George imagined Tully taking private boxing lessons, intending to use his skills against lesser mortals like himself. Poor Georgie! A little birdie told us that Georgie wasn't feeling at all well, said Tully in a mock childish voice. George could not decide whether Tully meant because of the fake cough or because of something else. The birdie said that poor Georgie Porgy had to go to the doctor yesterday. George was not reassured when Tully used his normal voice to continue. We only wanted our little friend Georgie to know that we're behind him all the way, don't we, lads? In response, the other three laughed uproariously. Turning back to glance at them, George saw that they were, in fact, walking right behind him. Tully, Mr. Wallace is expecting me before school, George lied, and prayed that Tully would believe him. Can't we talk about this later? Oh, it won't take long, Georgie boy, not long at all, not even a minute, said Tully. Or two, laughed John Dunn, his greasy hair standing up in all directions, uncombed. He was taking off his tie, rolling it around his hand and then stuffing it into his creased blazer's pocket. Uh-oh, not a particularly good sign, George thought. Or three, snorted Wayne Bailey. He took off his glasses and carefully and deliberately stowed them in his top pocket, patting it as if to make sure that they really were in there. En four, mumbled Neville Alice, looking down at his muddy shoes, apparently having spotted something of absorbing interest on them. Were they going to hurt him, or were their actions merely intended to scare him? Whatever the case, it worked. George was scared. By now they were nearing the trees on the far side of the playing field. George looked back to see if anyone had noticed. But, as he suspected, no one was following them, least of all Mr. Wallace. Why would he? Even though George did not really have an appointment with him, he had hoped that Mr. Wallace, who sometimes intervened when he saw fights in the playground, might have come to his rescue. Now, Georgie, said Tully, and pushed George so viciously against a tree that his top teeth connected hard with his bottom ones. A momentary feeling of whiplash passed through his skull, reminding him of the unpleasant sensation in his dream the night before. The four of them stood facing him, grinning, arms crossed. George had a mad sense that he was auditioning for some reality TV show. He certainly felt exposed and nervous enough. We know an interesting little fact about you. A little fact, we're thinking, you wouldn't like others to find out about. A little fact we feel you do almost anything to keep, private, shall we say? George went cold all over. They could not possibly know about the dreams, could they? His shameful secret. He would give anything not to keep having the dreams, these pests from his childhood, which filled him with disgust at his own inability to grow up. And the worst of it, his father was right, of course. They're for girls and wusses. No, he decided. There was no way they could know. He looked from one boy to the other, their eager, shining eyes resting expectantly on him. They wanted something from him, he realized. But what? George took a deep breath. I'm not sure what you think you know, he said, hoping they were bluffing too. Perhaps if you tell me, I'd be able to say if it was something private. Oh, we know it is, Georgie. There'll be no denying it. See, it came from my mum, and she knows everything, said Tully. He made his voice sound like he was doing a voiceover for a horror movie. We know about the counsellor. The others clearly found this hilarious and fell about laughing. George nearly collapsed, but he was not sure if it was from relief that they did not know about the dreams, or from the shock that they actually knew about the counsellor. How did Tully's mum find out? He was grateful for the tree behind him. It kept him standing upright. You see, said Wayne gleefully. I told you it would work. Just look at his face. He obviously doesn't want the whole world to know about it. Yes. Interesting, said Tully, rubbing his chin, apparently deep in consideration, staring so hard at George that it made him feel yet more uncomfortable. I must remember to thank my mum for this little fact. I don't think she even realised I could hear her gossiping to the neighbour. They're always at it. Yakety-yak, he demonstrated with his thumb and fingers. And such juicy bits too. It was Tully's turn to laugh. "Come on, Tully," said John, shooting furtive, nervous glances over his shoulder towards the school building. "Quit fooling around. Ask him." "What do you mean, ask him?" said Tully, suddenly serious. "There'll be no asking. There'll be only telling." He turned to George and stuck his face so close that their noses nearly touched, forcing George to inhale his minty toothpaste morning breath. "So, Georgie boy, I'm telling you, if you want your little secret to stay private, you'll write all our essays next semester, right?" That wasn't so bad, thought George as they walked back towards the school building, wondering if he should feel lucky that he got off so lightly. At least he did not get beaten up. And would it really be so difficult to write 4 extra essays each time? It would give him more practice at something he enjoyed anyway. The trick would be to write like they would, he reckoned. That would be the challenge. But during the first period, George realized he had not been so lucky after all. Constant remarks about maddos and psychos, crazies and loonies, and a lot of winks in his direction started others in the class whispering and glancing his way too. By the end of the day, the whole school seemed to know that George Andrew Faraday was scheduled to see a counsellor. Even those students who never even knew of his existence before now seemed to know his news too. And seeing a counsellor apparently immediately translated into the fact that George was a nut job, something several students had evidently suspected for a long time. When the bell went, George hung back, trying to avoid any further trouble, but he knew he could not stay in the room for the rest of the day. With his heart beating in his throat, he walked through the door, only to be met with a baying kind of noise and students with their backs turned towards him, barring the corridor. He stayed just long enough to understand that someone was fighting before he walked briskly in the opposite direction, refusing to look back. Of course, it did not come as a surprise to learn later that it had been Wayne fighting with another boy in his class who had dared to defend loonies. Turned out the boy's mum had suffered with mental illness all her life, and he did not find the fearsome foursome's comments funny at all. The boy's dad turned up, and he was suddenly removed from the school, and the fearsome foursome were given detention for the first month of the next semester, something which they wore with glee as an achievement rather than as punishment. After school, George waited self-consciously by the gate for his mum to collect him. It seemed everyone who walked past him had some comment or other to make about the state of his mind and his appointment with a counsellor. The whole school knows? Really? He thought. When he saw the fearsome foursome walking towards him, he knew for the first time what was meant by the saying, "Praying that the earth would open and swallow me," because that was exactly how he felt at that moment. But the earth did not open, and it did not swallow him, and there was nowhere for him to hide. Wayne's face in particular looked like thunder about to strike, and the other 3 looked equally unhappy. George shrunk back, but they seemed to ignore him, until, that is, they got level with him. They stopped, blocking the gate, and glared at him, hate naked in their eyes. Wayne's finger nearly took out George's eye as he mouthed, "I'm going to get you." Behind them, children were beginning to shout to be let through, and after what felt like an eternity to George, the taller boys finally moved on. George shifted against the gate and exhaled. It came as a surprise to him that he had been holding his breath. What could he do? He so did not want to be on their radar. And he was innocent. If they had not played the fool in class, no one would ever have known anything about it. This whole thing was their doing. On the other hand, though, George could understand their unhappiness, because it meant they no longer had anything to blackmail him with to write their essays for them. Outside the gate, they stopped again and glared at George. "We know where you live, Georgie Porgy," Wayne spat. Then the fearsome foursome's wildly forced laughs rang in his ears as they sauntered down the road to the bus stop. 4 unkempt tearaways to the uninitiated, but George knew better. Thank goodness no bus today, George sighed with relief. Running towards the gate, his floppy black hair windswept, came the most popular, most good-looking boy in the school, Davy Morgan. Davy's mum's silver BMW was waiting outside the gate. But before he dashed off to join his mum, Davy stopped in front of George, and in his fidgety, fast-talking manner told him not to worry, it was not too bad. He, Davy, had been seeing a counsellor for almost the whole term already, and he might have to continue to do so next semester as well. Then Davy gave him a quick hug, picked up his bag from where he had plonked it on the concrete, and sprinted through the gate. George, unused to male contact, and having received it for the second time on the same day, felt himself blush at Davy's hug, and dropping his head to try to mask it, shifted his weight onto his other foot. Davy's fresh shower smell still hung in the air when his twin sister Katie came running towards the gate. She stopped in front of George and, as fidgety and fast-talking as her twin, confirmed what Davy had said. "Don't worry, it's really not that bad," she said, and standing on tiptoes, gave him a lightning-fast peck on the cheek before she too ran through the gate. George felt himself blushing even deeper and lowered his head even further, so that his chin nearly touched his chest in an attempt to hide his red face, but his hand involuntarily went up to stroke the place on his cheek where she'd kissed him. Others were walking past him, pulling faces and behaving in a generally silly manner as they went through the gates, presumably laughing at their superior sanity and his perceived lunacy. Thankfully, no one seemed to have seen Katie's kiss or Davy's hug. That would definitely have done it for him, he reckoned. In his head, Wayne's words drummed over and over like a mantra. "We know where you live, Georgie Porgy. We know where you live, Georgie Porgy. We know where you live." Maybe this holiday was not one to look forward to after all. "You're very quiet, dear," said his mum in the car. "Are you all right?" Her worried eyes flashed on him for a second before she turned her attention back to driving. George nodded and tried to smile, but was only vaguely aware that his mum was telling him how much she was looking forward to her first visit to South Africa. She seemed full to bursting with excitement, her lovely face flushed, a little late from her lunch with her sister Di, where the South African trip had almost certainly been dissected and analysed to within an inch of its life. No doubt clothes and shoes discussed, and sites to visit, and promises extracted about photographic evidence. And apparently, his mum confirmed, Aunt Di was equally looking forward to spending the holiday with him. George did not doubt it. Not only was she his favourite aunt, he was her one and only favourite nephew. And since she had no children of her own, she indulged George's every wish with a touching selflessness and eagerness that he should at all times have fun and enjoy himself. For now, though, all he could think about was where Tully Tucker and the fearsome foursome were spending their summer holidays, or what his father was going to say when he found out about the counsellor, and then, as he was bound to, that the whole school now knew about it. He couldn't decide which of the two was worse.